Today I'm going to show you how to make this procedural desert made up of these dunes. I figured out a way to make these dunes that is pretty customizable, albeit a little hard to control. Because it's procedural though, you can set up a seed value and get many different versions within the same initial parameters that you set up. And you can even bake the mesh, although the method is a little complicated. I also did this interesting color variation and a few others too while experimenting. And if you don't want to make it, you can just buy it. I put it on my Gumroad as well. And I set up the controls, but I'll show you how to do all that in this video. To set up our scene, let's get rid of that cube and this light here. I'm going to bring in a plane, and then let's change this entire middle area to our shader editor. I'm going to grab the material that was on our cube, let's put it on our plane, and hit N to get rid of that shelf. The top right, I'm going to change this to my 3D viewport, and just hold down Z and go into rendered mode. I'm going to change the render engine from Eevee to cycles, change the feature set to experimental, and if you have a GPU, go ahead and select that as well. Come down here to the modifiers, and we're going to add a subdivision surface modifier, click adaptive subdivision, and change the levels viewport to 6. That'll help us see a little bit more detail. Then come down here to the material properties, and we'll scroll down to where it says settings. We're going to change it from bump only, where it says displacement, bump only, we're going to change that to displacement only. And now we're all set to do some displacement and cycles. I'm also going to make this 3D viewport a little larger because with adaptive subdivision it depends on pixel size. This will allow us to see a little bit more detail on our model as we're working. Since we got rid of our light, it's a little dark, so let's bring in some HDRI lighting. I'm going to click on this world properties, and next to this color here there's this circle, this yellow circle. Select environment texture, then click open and just find where you've got your HDRIs. I've got some free ones from HDR Haven I'm going to use. Check that website out if you don't have any. It's great. There's a lot of options. And I'm just going to choose one of these here. Let's go Lakeside. Should be fine. We've got our HDRI in the background. Come down here to Ray Visibility and click off Camera, and the background will disappear, but you'll still have the lighting, lighting your object. It's a really easy way to do nice lighting. You don't have to spend a lot of time setting it up. Let's move this principled BSDF out of the way and bring in a Voronoi texture. This is going to be the basis of our sand dune texture. While this is highlighted, hit Control T, and that's a node wrangler shortcut. That's just going to add the texture coordinate and mapping node on there. I'm going to move this mapping node out of the way. We don't really need that. And I'm going to bring in a displacement node. Place it right here. And run distance into height. If we run this into displacement, we can see our mesh gets displaced there. I'm going to change the scale to something much lower, to 0.1, and this is our sand dune, our basis for our sand dune texture here. So the next thing we're going to do is just make this a little bit more interesting. There's a lot of straight lines. It doesn't really look like sand dunes yet, so I'm going to bring in a noise texture and just place it right before that Voronoi. We can see it changes things quite a bit. So I'm going to bring in a mix RGB and place it right after there. Then let's plug the generated output from that texture coordinate into color 2 of that mix RGB. We're going to leave this noise as is, but we set this factor at 0.85 to lessen the effect of this noise texture. I'm going to hit Shift and hold right click to make a little node point there, and then duplicate this noise and this mix, and do the same thing where you plug generated into color 2. This first noise we're going to set to 10 for the scale and 4 for the detail, and this mix here we'll set this at 0.98. So already we have some interesting variation there in the lines, and you could spend a while fine-tuning this here, but this is how I had my setup in the original. So let's look at our principled BSDF there. You can see that the light is coming from kind of a high position, so we don't really have any shadows. So let's just adjust that really quick here. I'm going to turn on the ray visibility for the camera again for my HDRI, which again is just under this world properties and ray visibility. Just make sure that's checked. We can see that our light source is that sun up there, and it's a little high. So why don't we adjust that? Come over here in the shader editor. If you click on this object, you can select world, and then we've got our HDRI right here. I'm going to click on this lakeside texture here and hit Control T, and that's the same node wrangler shortcut as before, and it just allows us to change the rotation of our HDRI. So if I set this Y at something like -30, I think that'll kind of work. That might be a little much. Maybe -25. I think that works pretty well. It's kind of got an interesting shadow effect now. We can really see the dunes and the outlines a lot nicer there. So I'm going to click off the camera ray visibility again, we'll just go forward from here. Make sure to change this back to object from world, or else you won't be able to see your texture. So next I'm going to start creating the texture of the sand. And I liked the effect I got from a wave texture. If we take a look, it's just a bunch of parallel lines. And if I turn up this distortion value here, the lines start getting a little, interesting and wavy there. So I'm going to set that distortion value at 1. And let's turn up this wave texture to a scale of 300. Then I'm going to bring in a mapping node, place it right here, and run the output from this first mix factor into this vector here, and then that is going to go into the vector on the wave texture. You can see that these lines are quite a bit smaller. It's got distortion coming from this distortion value here and from this noise right here. The next thing I wanted to do is kind of interrupt these wave lines as they go over this little hill here. We can see that they just kind of continue on and they're the exact same. So I was just thinking if I took the color output of there, it would give me a different value. So I'm going to plug this into the rotation on that mapping node. We can see it kind of interrupts that a little bit, and to allow us to have some kind of amount of control over that, I'm going to bring in a vector math node, change this to multiply, then we can adjust these values here, and I'm going to drag across and change these to 0.4. And then I'm going to change this x value to 0.1 underneath the scale on that mapping node. And we can see that that helps kind of break these up a little bit. We've got some interesting smaller and larger wave textures in each cell boundary here. So I'm going to turn this scale up to 4000, and if we zoom in we can see it's gotten much smaller there, but it's the same kind of thing where it's got these interruptions with each cell boundary. And the next thing I wanted to try and do is make these lines a little shorter. I didn't want these lines to continue for so long. It seems like a lot of the pictures of sand that I look at, it doesn't really do that. So what I'm going to do is click on this mapping and wave texture and Control-Shift-D both of these guys here, so that we've got a new wave and a new mapping node, but they're still connected to this multiply and this mix RGB back here. Let's make this a little easier to look at. Then I'm going to come here to this mapping node and change this x value to 0.0002. Just shift it over a little bit, and I'm going to change this x multiply to 0.2. So it's a little bit different. I'm going to change this scale to 3000 and leave everything else the same. So if we look at this one here, it looks similar, but it's a little bit larger and it's just shifted over. The next thing I'm going to do is take this mapping node here and Control-Shift-D it one more time, and then I'm going to bring in a noise texture and just place it right here and plug this mapping into this noise texture here. I'm just going to undo these here, just change those all to 1 and change this back to 0. I'm going to come to this noise texture and change the scale to 400. If we look at this here, we can see it's that cloudy noise texture and all the details are much smaller there, so we can see it now. And I'm going to bring in a color ramp and place it on this needle right here, because we're going to crunch this a little bit here. We're going to bring the black up to 0.43 and the white's going to come down to 0.59. Just like that. So it's much more contrasted there. And let's just bring this over here. Then I'm going to mix these two wave textures together in a mix RGB, and I did that just by holding down Control-Shift and right-clicking and dragging from one wave texture to the other. And this is now going to go into our mix factor right here. And if we look at this, we can kind of see some interesting areas. Wherever there's black on this texture, it's going to show this first texture. And whenever there's white on this texture, it's going to show the second texture. And then there's kind of some spots in between where there's a gray gradient there. So we end up with this interesting looking thing here where these wave textures are basically overlaid on top of each other. So then I wanted to do one more thing too and make some spots where these textures aren't showing through. And to do that, I'm going to hit Control-Shift-D on this color ramp so that it stays attached to this noise texture. Then I'm going to change this black value. I'm going to change it to a 0.55 gray. So in the value, I'm just going to click there and change that value to 0.55. So we got this middle gray color here, and I'm going to change this position to 0.5 on that color ramp. And this white, we're going to keep it as white, but we're going to move it to 0.75 there. So then I'm going to duplicate this color or this mix RGB here, place it right here. Then I'm going to run this right into here. And if we look at what's going on, it just looks like a kind of a grayer version of this, but if I change this to black, then we can see some spots here. Basically, that wave texture is just interrupted, so we'll just get kind of a flat sand area on some of these spots here. I'm going to try and produce that effect one more time with a larger noise texture here as well. So I'm just going to bring in a noise texture again and just leave the values as the default values there. Bring in a color ramp here and just place that on the noodle right afterwards. We're going to change these values here. This black is going to change to a 0.4 gray, so just type it into that value space there. And this top white, we're going to change this to a 0.9 gray, so very light gray, almost white. We're going to keep that top one where it is, but this bottom one, we're going to bring this up to 0.15. So if we zoom out on our texture, we can see that noise coming through a little bit better. We're going to use this to add a bit more variation on the height of our kind of sand ripples there. So I'm going to make another mix RGB and not duplicate it because I want the second socket to be that default 0.735 gray there. We're going to add, we're going to plug this mix into color 1 there, and we're going to plug this color ramp into the factor there. So we can see in these dark gray colors, we're going to get a bit more of this original mix coming through, and in the lighter colors, we're going to get more of just kind of a flat sand texture. So that's just going to allow us to have a bit more variation in those ripples. Now we're at the point where we can add this displacement to our original Voronoi displacement. But before we do, I just want to discuss a quick bug, or at least I think it's a bug, that's been popping up for me. When I went to render this out, you can see all these areas where I'm guessing my cell boundaries are occurring. It's kind of pushed up the mesh in these weird, these weird little spots here, and I can't seem to get rid of that. Even when you look at my displacement, it's just coming out of the distance right now. It's not even coming out of the color. And even if I unplug this right here, you can see the same kind of thing. Let's just render this really quick. Yeah, as you can see, this is just the Voronoi, and I've got these weird areas, like I said, where it's just kind of creating these strange areas. So if you have any insight in what's going on here, I'd really like to know, because this wasn't happening to me a couple days ago. But anyway, for now, the solution I found on the modifiers panel, let's come over here where it says, I've got my subdivision surface modifier, where it says Catmull-Clark and simple. I'm going to change this to simple instead of Catmull-Clark. When I've rendered it out, you can see that seems to have fixed it. We don't have these weird areas anymore that were giving me trouble. So just make sure you change it from Catmull-Clark to simple. With that out of the way, let's add our two displacements together. And to do that, we're going to bring in a math node. So I'll just place it here. We'll leave it on add, and I'm going to plug this third mix RGB into that second socket. We can see the effect is too strong, so let's duplicate this add here, place it right here. We'll change this to multiply and change this value to something quite small. I found 0.003 to 0.001 worked quite well. 0.001 especially when you're zoomed in, but 0.003 works pretty well when you're zoomed out. So let's look at the principled BSDF. We can't really see it, but let's render it out and see what it looks like. Yeah, it looks pretty good. I'm happy with this. The last thing I want to do for displacement is put one more of these add math nodes. Just place it right after this existing one. We're going to run this noise actually right into this bottom value here. And what that does is it just makes it a bit more hilly. Pushes up some areas and pushes down some areas. I rendered it out so you can see what that noise displacement is doing at the end. Here it is without that noise, and then here it is with that noise added on. You can see it just given a bit more interest with pushing up some areas, pushing down some areas, so you get a bit more hilliness in these dunes. Next up, I want to look at adding some color to the sand. So to do that, I'm going to use something called a Fresnel node, and this node's really cool. It creates this kind of effect where it's dynamic. Depending on what angle you're looking at your object, it's going to change the color. So at a high angle, it appears much lighter, and when you're looking head on, it appears darker, like this dark gray. So I'm going to bring in a noise texture as well. We're just going to mix these together by holding Control Shift and right clicking and dragging from one node to the other. I'm going to open that up and bring in a color ramp and place it here. And we can see if we adjust these handles, we can kind of create some interesting effects. I'm going to leave it as the default for now and just plug it into the base color. Let's turn the roughness on our principled BSDF up to 1. Let's come to the noise texture and increase this scale from 5 to 20. And then for this mix RGB, let's change this to multiply, and then let's change the factor to 1. You get an interesting, cool noise / Fresnel effect. And I'm going to bring in a color ramp, place it right here, and then run this into the base color. and then change the roughness on our principal BSDF to 1. Let's see what that looks like. Let's come to this color ramp, and I'm going to click on this black color, and I've got the hex value selected. And I can just put a code in here, and you can put the same code in, and you'll get the same color as me. It's a pretty quick way of doing that. So this first one is going to be 74614C, and that's kind of a medium brown color. And then this white, we're going to change this one to A78C6D. That's kind of a lighter version of that one there. We can bring this down if we want. It's really up to you. I kind of liked the effect I had when this second handle was at 0.1 and this first was at 0, but play around with it and just see what different effects you can get. I'm going to try rendering this out and just see what it looks like. That looks pretty cool. Could maybe make this ripple effect a little stronger. Let's try that out. I'm going to add in a bump node. Just place it right here, and I'm going to run this third mix RGB right into the height, and then run this normal into the normal on our principal BSDF. I'm going to change this strength to 0.1. Let's render that out and see what it looks like. That looks good. I'm happy with that. But if you did want to change it, you could decrease or increase the strength on either this bump node or this multiply node, and it would increase or decrease the ripple effect. Another thing you could do with the color ramp is come over here and change from linear to constant. Then you get these interesting stark lines that contrast where these two colors change. It looks pretty interesting. It looks kind of like cell shading or something similar. I'm also going to show you how to do that interesting colorful pattern that I showed you at the beginning of the video. This first color, let's change this. We're going to type in a different hex code here, and this time it's going to be 74314F. That gives us kind of a pink-red color. If we zoom out, we can see it. There it is on the scale there. We're going to come over here to RGB and change this to HSV, then change it from near to far. And so what we're getting is this little kind of rainbow spectrum. It basically goes, I'm going to zoom out again, it basically goes from this color to this color, but it takes a long way around. So it goes around like this here, and it gives you all those colors in between. Now we have this interesting kind of psychedelic pattern on our sand that looks really cool. We can see that this is a dynamic color that changes with the angle that we look at, thanks to this Fresnel node here. So it can be good and bad. It's just something to be aware of. Depending on the angle, this is going to be a different color pattern. Now that we've got this all set up, let's set up a group node so we can control this a little bit better. The only thing I'm not going to put in my group are these four nodes right here, the Fresnel, the noise, this multiply, and this color ramp. And the reason is if we do that, then we don't really have access to this color ramp. We can't do that HSV stuff. So I'm just going to move that out of the way and grab all of these except for this material output. And I'm going to hit Control G, and that creates a group here. So we've got this thing right here, which is our group input, and we can tab in and out of this to go in and out of our group. So I'm just going to move this over here. It's a little easier to look at, and move my material output a little closer. And it looks like I want to switch these around, so I'm going to tab back into here by selecting that group there, hit N, and then let's go up to the node here. We can move these up and down with these arrows. So I'm going to select this displacement and just move it down. Now when we tab out, it's a little nicer to look at. So we need to create a whole bunch of inputs here to allow us to control our sand dunes without going into this group node. It'll be a lot easier to look at. So the first control let's set up is our sand dune size. So I'm just going to bring this group node a little closer, and we want this Voronoi node, we want the scale to be accessible. So let's go ahead and drag that over to this empty spot right here, and it just puts a note, it titles it scale there. So we can change that. Come over here and type in dune size, just like that. Next, let's grab the ripple bump, which is over here. We can drag in the strength to this next spot right here, and let's call that ripple bump. Then we want the ripple displacement, which is this multiply node right here. So let's drag that in there and highlight this one here. Type in ripple displacement. Next one I want to do is the size of the ripples. So this one's going to be a little more complicated. I'm just going to bring in a math node as kind of a placeholder. I'm just going to plug it into the scale on both of these wave textures, which are controlling our ripple size. And then I'm going to duplicate this math node and change it to multiply. And I'm going to change this value to 400. This value here in the scale was 4,000, so we're just going to change the number, upstream of this to 10. So it's going to be 10 multiplied by 400 equals 4,000. So I'm going to duplicate this multiply, and because this was 3,000 down here, I'm going to change this one to 300. Now I'm going to make a little reroute right here over both of these lines, though, just like this. And let's grab our group input, and we'll run this right into here. I guess we can't. We have to go this way because of that add. And I'm going to get rid of that add. We don't need it anymore. So we'll go to this input right here, and this is going to be the ripple size. And let's tab out for a second here as well, because this is set to 0 as a default. So we want to set this at 10, because that's going to allow us to multiply those numbers correctly. Then let's tab back into that group and click on this multiply and hit Control-Shift-D so that we duplicate it while it's still attached up here. And instead of 300, we'll change this to 40, because 10 times 40 is 400, just like we've got here. We want to synchronize this noise scale as well if we change the ripples. So let's tab back in here, and the next thing I want to set up is something that allows us to generate different seed values, so we can have unlimited variations on the same parameters. So to do that, I'm going to bring in a mapping node and place it right after this texture coordinate node. And we want something to go into this location here. So let's go ahead and feed this in there. And it calls it location. So let's rename that to seed. Seed value maybe. It doesn't really matter what you call it. Just remember what it does. Then let's come over here to this multiply node, because this allows us to control the ripple rotation to a certain extent there. So let's feed that in there, and let's rename that ripple rotation. And the last thing is the displacement value at the end here, the total displacement, not just the ripple displacement. Let's allow us to control that as well. So this displacement node here, we want the scale to be running in there. So we'll run that into this last one right here, and we'll just call this displacement. Okay, now that we got everything set up, we can tab out of there, and the hard part is done. Now we can adjust all these settings just from this group, and we don't have to go inside. This seed value is nice too. We can put any value here, like 1, on any of these axes, and it gives us a different output here. We could also just rotate this on the z-axis and get a lot of different variation as well in those dunes. Here's some of the results I was able to get. So that's it. Hope you're able to follow along with everything I was doing, and if you have any questions, feel free and ask me in the comments there. Hopefully you can see how you could change it around, make it really interesting and cool, and probably add on to what I've done. Thanks for watching.